The dusty town of Clearwater Ridge had seen many strangers pass through its wooden boardwalks, but none quite like the man who rode in on that scorching Tuesday afternoon. Jake Morrison adjusted his worn leather hat as he guided his horse through the main street, his keen eyes scanning the faces of townsfolk who quickly averted their gazes. Something felt wrong in this place, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The silence was unnatural for a town of this size. Children should have been playing in the streets, merchants calling out their wares, and the usual bustle of frontier life should have filled the air. Instead, an oppressive quiet hung over Clearwater Ridge like a heavy blanket. The few people Jake did see moved with hurried, nervous steps, their eyes darting toward the shadows as if expecting danger to emerge at any moment. Jake had been tracking the notorious gang led by Black Pete Saunders for 3 weeks now. The outlaw and his men had been terrorizing settlements across the territory, robbing banks, stealing cattle, and leaving destruction in their wake. Local law enforcement seemed powerless against them, and desperate town councils had started pooling their resources to hire bounty hunters and skilled gunfighters to bring justice to their communities. As Jake approached the town's only saloon, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through the grimy windows, he could see several rough-looking men gathered around tables, their guns prominently displayed, and their laughter carrying an edge of cruelty. But what truly caught his attention was the sight of 2 young women serving drinks with obvious reluctance, their movements stiff with fear. The women appeared to be sisters, both with long dark hair and olive skin that spoke of mixed heritage. What struck Jake most powerfully were the intricate markings adorning their arms and faces. These weren't tattoos in the conventional sense, but traditional tribal designs that seemed to tell a story of ancient lineage and cultural significance. The patterns were beautiful yet somehow foreboding, as if they carried power beyond mere decoration. Jake dismounted his horse and tied the reins to the hitching post outside the saloon. His hand instinctively moved to check his revolver, ensuring it sat properly in its holster. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being was telling him that these women were in serious trouble. As he pushed through the saloon's swinging doors, conversations died, and all eyes turned toward him. The interior was dimly lit, with smoke from cheap cigars creating a hazy atmosphere that made it difficult to see clearly into the darker corners. Jake counted at least 8 men scattered throughout the room, all bearing the hardened look of career criminals. Their clothes were expensive but dirty, suggesting recent ill-gotten gains, and their weapons were well-maintained despite their otherwise slovenly appearance. The older of the 2 women approached his table with a pitcher of water and a glass. Up close, Jake could see that her tribal markings were even more elaborate than he had first realized. They covered not just her arms and face, but continued down her neck, and presumably across other parts of her body, hidden by her simple dress. The designs seemed to incorporate symbols from various Native American traditions. But there were other elements as well that Jake couldn't immediately identify. "What can I bring you, mister?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying a slight accent that confirmed Jake's suspicion about her mixed heritage. Her dark eyes held a depth of worry that spoke volumes about her current situation. "Just coffee, ma'am," Jake replied, keeping his voice low and respectful. "And perhaps you could tell me if there's a place in town where a traveler might find lodging for the night." Before the woman could answer, a harsh voice cut through the air from the back of the room. "Maria, get back over here and bring us another bottle. And tell your sister to stop moving so slow, or we'll find ways to motivate her." The threat in the man's voice was unmistakable, and Jake saw Maria's hands tremble slightly as she set down the water pitcher. The speaker was a large man with a black beard and cruel eyes, wearing a vest that looked like it had been expensive before being stained with God knows what. This had to be Black Pete Saunders himself. Jake forced himself to remain calm as Maria hurried away to fulfill the outlaw's demands. He used the opportunity to study the room more carefully, noting the positions of all the gang members and identifying potential cover if shooting broke out. The younger sister, who looked to be perhaps 18 years old, was currently serving a table near the front window. Her markings were similar to Maria's but seemed to focus more on her hands and forearms, creating patterns that almost seemed to move in the flickering lamplight. As Jake sipped his coffee, he listened carefully to the conversations around him. The gang members were discussing their next target, a bank in the neighboring town of Millfield. They spoke casually about the violence they planned to inflict, treating human life as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. But what disturbed Jake most was their discussion of the two women. "Those markings sure are something, ain't they?" one of the younger gang members said with a lewd grin. "Never seen nothing like them before. Makes a man curious about what other secrets these girls might be hiding." "Oh, shut up, Tommy," Black Pete growled. "We ain't keeping them around for your entertainment. Those marks mean something special. Something that could be worth more than all the banks we've robbed put together. I've heard stories about people like them, about the power those symbols represent." Jake's interest was immediately piqued. Black Pete seemed to know something about the tribal markings that went beyond their obvious cultural significance. The outlaw's tone suggested he believed the markings had some kind of supernatural or mystical importance, which struck Jake as odd coming from a hardened criminal who typically wouldn't concern himself with such matters. The afternoon wore on, and Jake remained in the saloon, nursing his coffee and observing the dynamics at play. It became increasingly clear that the two women were being held against their will, though the exact nature of their captivity remained unclear. They moved through the room serving drinks and food, but their routes were carefully monitored by the gang members, and any attempt to approach the doors or windows was immediately blocked. As evening approached, Jake noticed that the tribal markings on both women seemed to become more pronounced in the changing light. The patterns appeared to shift and flow, creating an almost hypnotic effect that drew the eye and held it. Several of the gang members had noticed this phenomenon as well, and their conversations increasingly centered on the potential value of their captives. "I'm telling you, Pete," the man called Tommy said for the third time that hour, "we should just take what we can get and move on. This whole thing is starting to give me the creeps." Black Pete's response was swift and violent. He backhanded Tommy across the face with enough force to knock the younger man from his chair. "I said shut up about it. We're staying until I figure out exactly what we've got here. Those marks didn't just appear for no reason. And I ain't leaving until I know what they're worth." Whoa. The violence seemed to trigger something in the markings themselves. Jake watched in amazement as the patterns on both women's skin began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light. The effect was subtle enough that some of the gang members didn't immediately notice, but those who did became visibly agitated. Maria and her sister exchanged a meaningful look across the room, and Jake could see them communicating in some way that didn't require words. The tribal markings seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats, growing brighter as their fear and determination increased. Whatever power these symbols represented, it was becoming increasingly active as the situation grew more dangerous. Jake realized he was witnessing something far beyond his usual experience with outlaws and frontier justice. These weren't just two innocent women caught up in criminal activity. They were something more, something that Black Pete Saunders had stumbled upon without fully understanding what he was dealing with. The tribal markings weren't merely decorative or cultural symbols. They represented some kind of genuine power that was responding to the threat posed by their captors. As the sun began to set outside the saloon windows, Jake made his decision. Whatever was happening here, whatever those markings meant, he couldn't stand by and watch two women suffer at the hands of these criminals. He had tracked Black Pete Saunders across 3 states to bring him to justice. But this situation had evolved into something much more complex than a simple arrest. The glowing of the tribal markings intensified as darkness fell, and Jake could see that some of the gang members were becoming genuinely frightened. The patterns seemed to be telling a story, depicting scenes of ancient battles and spiritual ceremonies that spoke of power beyond human understanding. Both women stood straighter now, as if drawing strength from whatever force the markings represented. Jake finished his coffee and slowly stood up, his hand resting casually near his gun. The time for observation was coming to an end, and soon he would have to act. But first, he needed to understand exactly what kind of power he was dealing with, and whether Maria and her sister were allies he could count on in the confrontation that was surely coming. The tension in the saloon reached a breaking point as the tribal markings on both women began to pulse with an increasingly intense light. Jake watched from his corner table as Black Pete Saunders grew more agitated with each passing moment, his earlier confidence giving way to something that looked suspiciously like fear. The outlaw leader kept glancing between Maria and her younger sister, clearly uncertain about how to handle a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. "What's happening to them?" whispered one of the gang members, a thin man with nervous eyes who kept fidgeting with his gun belt. "Pete! Maybe we should just take what money they've got and get out of here." Black Pete slammed his fist on the table, causing bottles and glasses to jump and rattle. "Nobody's going anywhere until I say so. Those marks mean something valuable, and I ain't leaving empty-handed." But Jake could see that the outlaw's bravado was beginning to crack. The markings on the two women had evolved from a subtle glow to something far more dramatic. The patterns now seemed to move across their skin like living things, shifting and changing in response to their emotional state. More disturbing still, the designs appeared to be spreading, creating new connections between existing symbols and extending into areas that had previously been unmarked. Maria stepped forward, her dark eyes now holding a confidence that hadn't been there before. When she spoke, her voice carried a power that seemed to resonate through the entire room. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Black Pete Saunders. These markings aren't just decoration or cultural tradition. They're a connection to something far older and more powerful than your small criminal mind could ever comprehend." The outlaw leader's hand moved toward his gun, but something in Maria's tone made him hesitate. Jake noticed that several of the other gang members had begun backing toward the walls, their usual swagger replaced by obvious nervousness. The atmosphere in the saloon had become thick and oppressive, as if the very air was charged with electricity before a major storm. "My sister and I are the last daughters of the Moonwind tribe," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Our people were guardians of ancient knowledge, protectors of powers that white men tried to destroy, but could never fully eliminate. These markings you see are not tattoos or paint. They are the manifestation of our bloodline, our connection to the spirit world, and our responsibility to protect the innocent." Jake found himself leaning forward, fascinated despite the danger of the situation. He had heard stories of Native American tribes with mystical abilities, but had always assumed they were exaggerated tales told around campfires. Seeing the evidence before his eyes forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the world. The younger sister, who Jake now learned was called Elena, moved to stand beside Maria. As she did so, the markings on both women began to glow even brighter, and Jake could swear he saw images moving within the intricate patterns. Scenes of warriors in battle, shamans conducting ceremonies, and great spirits taking the form of animals all seemed to play out across their skin like some kind of supernatural theater. "The spirits of our ancestors are awakening," Elena said, her voice carrying the same otherworldly quality as her sister's. "They have been sleeping, waiting for a time when their power would be needed to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. Your greed and cruelty have awakened forces you cannot hope to control." Black Pete's nerve finally broke, and he drew his gun with a snarled curse. "Enough of this mystical nonsense. You're just two women, and marks on your skin don't make you bulletproof." But as the outlaw raised his weapon, something extraordinary happened. The tribal markings on both women suddenly blazed with brilliant white light, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Jake felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he witnessed power unlike anything he had ever imagined. The light from the markings began to take shape, forming ghostly figures that filled the saloon with their presence. Jake could see the spirits of ancient warriors standing beside Maria and Elena, their translucent forms armed with spectral weapons and bearing expressions of fierce determination. These weren't mere hallucinations or tricks of the light. They were genuine manifestations of something beyond the physical world. Black Pete's gun trembled in his hand as he faced this supernatural display. Several of his men had already dropped their weapons and were pressing themselves against the walls, terror written across their faces. The thin man who had suggested leaving earlier was now openly weeping, his nerve completely shattered by the otherworldly scene unfolding before him. "You wanted to know what these markings represent?" Maria said, her voice now echoing with the power of multiple speakers. "They represent justice for those who cannot fight for themselves. They represent the continuation of ancient wisdom in a world that has forgotten its spiritual roots. And they represent punishment for those who prey upon the innocent." The ghostly warriors began to move through the saloon, their forms becoming more solid with each passing second. Jake realized he was witnessing something that would change his understanding of reality forever. These weren't just symbols or cultural artifacts. They were genuine connections to forces that existed beyond the material world. One of the spirit warriors approached Black Pete, raising what appeared to be a tomahawk that glowed with the same white light as the markings. The outlaw leader fired his gun in panic, but the bullet passed harmlessly through the ghostly figure without having any effect. The spirit's weapon, however, was apparently quite capable of affecting the physical world, as it knocked the gun from Black Pete's hand with a strike that left the outlaw crying out in pain. Jake knew this was his moment to act. While the gang members were distracted by the supernatural display, he drew his own weapon and stepped into the center of the room. "Stop right there!" he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'll take them in." His words seemed to have an immediate effect on the mystical energy filling the saloon. The ghostly warriors turned toward him, and Jake felt their ancient eyes studying him with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. For a moment, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake by revealing himself as a lawman in the presence of such powerful forces. But Maria looked at him with something that might have been approval. "You're not like them," she said, her voice still carrying supernatural resonance. "Your spirit burns with justice, not greed." The ancestors recognized the difference. The tribal markings on both women began to shift again, the patterns rearranging themselves into new configurations that seemed to focus their power more precisely. Jake realized that the mystical energy in the room was now working with him rather than against him, supporting his efforts to bring the criminals to justice. Black Pete Saunders looked around wildly, his gang scattered and demoralized by the supernatural forces arrayed against them. Some of his men had already thrown down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Others were trying to escape through the windows, only to find their way blocked by spirit warriors who materialized wherever they attempted to flee. "This ain't possible," Black Pete muttered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Ghosts and spirits don't exist. This has got to be some kind of trick." Elena stepped forward, her markings now blazing so brightly that they illuminated the entire saloon. "Your disbelief doesn't make our power any less real. Black Pete Saunders, you and your men have committed crimes against innocent people across this territory. The spirits of justice have been awakened, and they demand retribution." Jake found himself caught between his duty as a lawman and his amazement at the supernatural forces surrounding him. He had come to Clearwater Ridge to arrest Black Pete Saunders and his gang for their crimes, but the situation had evolved into something far beyond normal frontier justice. The tribal markings on Maria and Elena represented a form of justice that was older and more powerful than anything written in law books. The spirit warriors began to close in on the remaining gang members, their ghostly weapons glowing with otherworldly fire. Jake realized that these ancient forces were preparing to dispense their own form of justice, and he wasn't sure whether he should try to stop them or simply let supernatural retribution take its course. As the mystical energy in the room reached its peak, Jake understood that he was witnessing a pivotal moment in the conflict between ancient wisdom and modern lawlessness. The tribal markings on Maria and Elena had turned the tide of the confrontation, transforming what should have been a dangerous hostage situation into a supernatural reckoning that would determine the fate of everyone present. The supernatural energy in the saloon reached its climax as the spirit warriors surrounded Black Pete Saunders and his remaining gang members. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the room, his gun drawn but somehow feeling inadequate in the presence of such otherworldly power. The tribal markings on Maria and Elena continued to blaze with brilliant white light, and the ghostly figures of their ancestors moved with purpose and determination. Black Pete had pressed himself against the bar, his face pale with terror as one of the spirit warriors approached him with a glowing tomahawk raised high. The outlaw leader's hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to comprehend what was happening to him. His criminal career had involved countless acts of violence and intimidation, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for facing the wrath of ancient spirits. "Please," Black Pete whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't understand what's happening here. Just tell me what you want." Maria stepped forward, her markings pulsing with each heartbeat as she spoke. "What we want is justice for all the innocent people you and your gang have hurt. The spirits of our ancestors have witnessed your crimes, and they demand that you face the consequences of your actions." Jake found himself in a unique position as both law enforcement officer and witness to supernatural justice. He realized that the normal procedures of arrest and trial might not apply in this situation. The tribal markings on the two women represented a form of authority that predated written law by thousands of years. "Wait," Jake called out, his voice cutting through the mystical atmosphere. "I understand that these men have committed terrible crimes, but as a lawman, I have a duty to see that justice is carried out according to proper legal procedures." Elena turned toward him, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of her markings. "Your laws are new, Cowboy. Our justice is older than your civilization. Which do you think carries more weight in the eyes of the universe?" The question hit Jake harder than he had expected. He had spent his entire adult life believing in the importance of written law and proper legal procedures. But witnessing the power of the tribal markings and the manifestation of spirit warriors forced him to consider whether there might be forms of justice that transcended human institutions. One of the ghostly warriors moved closer to Jake, and he could feel the ancient presence studying him with supernatural intensity. The spirit seemed to be evaluating his character, measuring his soul against standards that had existed long before courts and judges were ever conceived. Jake felt exposed and vulnerable under that otherworldly scrutiny, but he also sensed that he was being found worthy of respect. "Your heart is true, lawman," the spirit warrior spoke, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You seek justice, not vengeance. You protect the innocent, not your own interests. The ancestors recognize your worth." The acknowledgement from the spirit warrior filled Jake with a strange sense of validation. He realized that the supernatural forces in the room weren't opposed to law and order, but rather represented a deeper, more fundamental form of justice that complemented rather than conflicted with his own mission. Black Pete Saunders chose that moment to make a desperate play for freedom. While everyone's attention was focused on the conversation between Jake and the spirits, the outlaw leader lunged toward a fallen gun near one of the overturned tables. His movement was swift and unexpected, driven by the kind of desperation that comes from facing one's own mortality. But the spirit warriors were faster. Before Black Pete could reach the weapon, ghostly hands seized him and lifted him into the air. The outlaw found himself suspended 3 feet off the ground, held in place by forces he couldn't see or understand. His legs kicked frantically as he struggled against the supernatural restraints, but his efforts were completely futile. "Your time of running is over, Black Pete Saunders," Maria declared, her voice resonating with ancient authority. "The spirits have judged you guilty of countless crimes against innocent people. Your victims call out for justice from beyond the grave, and their voices will be heard." Jake watched in fascination as the tribal markings on both women began to change again. The patterns shifted and flowed, creating new designs that seemed to tell the story of Black Pete's criminal career. Jake could see images of robbery victims, terrorized townspeople, and murdered lawmen all playing out across Maria and Elena's skin like some kind of supernatural court record. The spirit warriors holding Black Pete began to glow more brightly, and the outlaw's struggles grew weaker as some kind of mystical energy flowed through him. Jake realized that the ancient forces weren't simply planning to kill the criminal, but were subjecting him to some form of spiritual judgment that would force him to confront the full weight of his actions. "I can see them," Black Pete whispered, his voice filled with horror. "I can see all the people I've hurt. They're here, watching me, waiting for." His words trailed off into incoherent mumbling. As the supernatural judgment continued, Elena approached Jake, her markings now glowing with a softer, more gentle light. "The spirits are showing him the truth of his actions, lawman. He is experiencing the pain and fear he has caused others. This is justice in its purest form." Jake found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to intervene on behalf of proper legal procedures, but another part recognized that what he was witnessing might represent a more complete form of justice than any court could provide. Black Pete Saunders was being forced to truly understand the consequences of his actions in a way that no prison sentence could accomplish. The other gang members who remained in the saloon had collapsed to their knees, overwhelmed by the supernatural display of power. Some were weeping openly, while others stared in stunned silence at the fate that had befallen their leader. Jake realized that they were all experiencing their own form of spiritual reckoning, forced to confront the reality of their crimes through mystical means. As the judgment continued, Jake noticed that the tribal markings on Maria and Elena were beginning to change in a different way. The aggressive patterns of spiritual warfare were giving way to designs that spoke of healing, protection, and renewal. The ancient forces that had awakened to dispense justice were now preparing to restore balance to the community that had been disrupted by criminal activity. "What happens now?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about how this supernatural intervention would conclude. Maria looked at him with eyes that held both ancient wisdom and modern compassion. "Now, the spirits will decide what form justice should take. Some of these men may be redeemed through genuine repentance and efforts to make amends for their crimes. Others may face consequences that your law books have no words to describe." The spirit warriors released Black Pete, allowing him to collapse to the floor in a heap. The outlaw leader looked broken and defeated, his earlier arrogance completely destroyed by his supernatural experience. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can see them all," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Every person I've hurt, every life I've destroyed. How do I make it right? How do I undo what I've done?" Jake realized that the tribal markings had accomplished something that conventional justice never could have achieved. They had forced a hardened criminal to genuinely confront the human cost of his actions and experience genuine remorse for his crimes. This wasn't just punishment, but the beginning of what might actually be redemption. Elena knelt beside Black Pete, her markings now glowing with healing energy rather than aggressive power. "Redemption is possible for those who truly seek it," she said gently. "But it requires more than just words. It requires a lifetime of actions dedicated to making amends for the harm you have caused." The other gang members were experiencing similar transformations. Those who were capable of genuine repentance found themselves embraced by healing energy from the tribal markings, while those whose hearts remained closed to redemption faced continued spiritual torment. Jake holstered his gun, realizing that conventional law enforcement was no longer necessary in this situation. The ancient forces represented by Maria and Elena's markings had accomplished more in a few minutes than months of legal proceedings could have achieved. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the possibility for genuine redemption had been offered to those willing to accept it. As the supernatural energy in the saloon began to fade, Jake found himself forever changed by what he had witnessed. The tribal markings on the two women had revealed the existence of forms of justice and power that transcended human understanding. He understood now that true law enforcement meant more than just arresting criminals and following procedures. It meant protecting the innocent, seeking genuine justice, and remaining open to the possibility that there were forces in the world greater than human institutions. The spirit warriors began to fade as dawn approached, their ancient duty fulfilled. Maria and Elena's markings settled into gentle, steady patterns that spoke of peace and protection rather than warfare and judgment. The crisis was over, justice had been served, and the community of Clearwater Ridge could begin to heal from the trauma inflicted by Black Pete Saunders and his gang. Jake Morrison mounted his horse as the sun rose over the town, knowing that his life had been forever changed by his encounter with forces beyond human understanding. The tribal markings had indeed turned the tide, but more than that, they had shown him that justice could take forms he had never imagined possible.